Welcome to another Big Train Tour at the Colorado Railroad Museum. This month, we'll be taking a look at one of the very last steam locomotives built for the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. Moved to the museum for display in 1963, this proud and massive locomotive sported tall drivers and the ability to pull fast, heavy trains along the Burlington's main lines. Today, Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy number 5629 is proudly displayed at the museum, showcasing the zenith of American steam locomotion. Hi, I'm Paul Hammond, Executive Director of the Colorado Railroad Museum. Our subject today is one of the largest preserved steam locomotives in Colorado. This locomotive incorporated a number of the latest technologies and enhancements when it was built on the eve of World War II. It would serve dutifully during the busy wartime years and for another decade following. But the railroad industry would adopt the new technology of the diesel-electric locomotive during the same time frame, leading to early retirements for even the most modern steam locomotives. Come join me now as we explore this proud and powerful symbol of Colorado railroading. The earliest steam locomotives were fairly simple contraptions, mechanically speaking. A fire was burned, water was turned into steam, and this steam was then regulated into cylinders to push pistons that in turn rotated the wheels. Speed was limited until reliable pilot wheels and better track were developed, helping guide trains along more smoothly and safely. The speed and pulling power of steam locomotives increased dramatically between the 1850s and 1900, especially with the advent of heavier steel rails. Around the turn of the 20th century, locomotives on mainline railroads grew much bigger. This was a direct result of innovations that had allowed fuel to be added to the firebox mechanically rather than by hand or shovel. For coal-burning locomotives, the mechanical stoker was the key. The size of locomotive fireboxes grew dramatically, and of course, so too did power output. Wheel arrangements changed to better support and distribute the locomotive's weight, with trailing trucks or wheel sets becoming an important part of the equation. Locomotive tenders also grew in size to carry the increasing amounts of fuel that were needed. The development of the steam locomotive reached new heights in the 1920s. The economy was booming and freight and passenger traffic was brisk. Railroads were investing in new locomotives and cars following the end of World War I. Heavier and longer trains were becoming the norm, and existing fleets of locomotives often had to be double-headed or trains broken up into multiple sections. This increased operating costs and added capacity constraints on some of the busiest railroads. Bigger and more powerful locomotives were one answer to this situation, and one wheel arrangement in particular would stand out, the 484 Northern type. The American Locomotive Company rolled out the first of these 484 Northerns in 1926. The idea was to create a locomotive with a very large firebox grate area. This is the heating surface where the fuel is burned, and to equip it with all of the latest technology for the superheating of steam. Superheating simply means that once water is heated up and turned to steam in the primary boiler tubes, it is then superheated to an even higher temperature by passing the heated steam through a convection process in the smoke box. With their 4 leading wheels, 8 main drivers that were often quite large, and 4 trailing wheels, these Northerns were destined to become perhaps the ultimate and certainly one of the most successful passenger and fast freight locomotives to serve on North America's railroads. Their wheel arrangement and overall configuration provided added stability for these heavy locomotives at higher speeds, making them especially attractive to railroads looking for speed and power on relatively flat routes. Some 36 different companies in both the US and Canada would operate over 1,100 of these powerful machines in the final decades of steam operations. Here in the Intermountain West, Some of the railroad's operating northerns would include the Union Pacific, Denver and Rio Grande Western, Chicago, Rock Island and Pacific, and of course the Chicago, Burlington and Quincy. Not long after the very first northerns appeared, the Chicago, Burlington and Quincy took delivery of 8 of this new type of locomotive in 1930. Built by the world's largest builder of steam locomotives, Baldwin, these locomotives were numbered 5600 through 5607. The 8 classmates burned coal, which was fed into their massive fireboxes by a mechanical stoker under the control of the firemen. Outfitted with 74-inch drivers, taller than an average person, the new locomotives quickly proved their abilities on the Burlington system, especially in terms of power and speed. Were it not for the Great Depression intervening, the railroad might well have ordered more of these modern engines right away. As traffic levels recovered a few years later, the Burlington in 1937 built 13 more of these powerful locomotives in its own West Burlington, Iowa shops using boilers constructed by Baldwin. Like the earlier northerns built by Baldwin, these new locomotives were equipped with feedwater heaters. These heaters were yet another innovation, one which helped to conserve fuel by preheating cold water from the locomotive's tender using exhaust steam before the water was injected into the boiler to create more steam. Just a year later, the Burlington began building what would become its very last new steam locomotives. Between 1938 and 1940, a total of 15 additional 484 locomotives were constructed, also in the railroad's West Burlington shops. This final order of northerns included number 5629, and all 15 of these Class 05A steam locomotives were equipped with even more innovations. These improvements included solid cast steel pilots, which helped give the locomotives an especially sleek appearance. The running gear included box-pock cast drivers, which were a proprietary rigid hollow casting that was superior to typical solid cast spoke drivers for high-speed locomotives. Also included were lightweight driving rods, which helped reduce the amount of rotating weight that required balancing for high speeds, and roller bearings, which were relatively new to railroading and which reduced rolling resistance. Rounding out the improvements were vestibule cabs, which provided a more climate-controlled work environment for the locomotive's operating crew. When these new northern-type steam locomotives were first introduced on the Burlington in 1930, the diesel locomotive was in its infancy. These powerful, fast steamers became stars of the railroad's east-west main line, stretching from Chicago to Denver via Omaha. They could be found pulling heavy, long passenger trains on tight schedules, but it was fast freight trains that were really their specialty. The Burlington introduced its famous diesel-electric-powered Zephyr streamliners in 1934. The public loved these shiny new diesel locomotives and sleek stainless steel cars, but it would take the railroad well over a decade before it could replace older locomotives and cars with new ones. As the world prepared for war in the late 1930s, rail traffic levels rose quickly. The addition of more northerns to the Burlington's locomotive stable was timed to help with the heavy wartime demands placed on America's railroads. Locomotive number 5629 immediately had an important role to play when it rolled out of the Burlington shops in 1940. An advertisement promoted the railroad's newest locomotives around that same time. "It pays to ship and travel Burlington" was the headline. In October 1944, one of the railroad's proud Class 05 Northerns hauled a record-breaking 82-car mail train loaded with mail and packages headed for overseas military units. This provided a stunning example of the capabilities of these powerful modern steamers. America's railroads moved record amounts of freight and passengers during World War II, and the Burlington was quite busy alongside other railroads. Following the war, our locomotive in the mid-1940s was transferred to the Burlington's Chicago to Twin Cities main line, where it continued to haul fast, heavy trains along the banks of the Mississippi River. In that service, the locomotive was likely admired by passengers aboard the Twin Cities Zephyr, itself pulled by the newfangled diesel locomotives. Number 5629 was likely also pressed into service, pulling occasional passenger trains during this time. The locomotive made its way back west in 1950, pulling freight trains between Lincoln, Nebraska, and Denver. Around this same time, the locomotive was converted to burn oil instead of coal. Along with many of its siblings, a gyrating Mars-type headlight was added to the front end of number 5629 as well, updating its appearance and providing added visibility when operating at night. As America's railroads rushed to dieselize following World War II, the Burlington was no different. Diesel-electric locomotives were proving beyond a doubt that not only could they pull heavy loads, but that they also required far less care, feeding, and maintenance than steam locomotives. This would soon mean that steam locomotives built only a decade or two earlier would be retired, well before the end of their useful economic life. Just like pretty much all other North American railroads, the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy was itself phasing out steam locomotives by the 1950s. The railroad's final regular service mainline steam train ran in 1959. Even before then, in 1956, locomotive number 5629 was placed in storage at Lincoln, Nebraska. This might well have been the end. Many of the locomotive's classmates also were placed in storage, then sold off for scrap soon after that. Luckily, number 5629 found new duties, serving as a stationary boiler at several points in Nebraska through the early 1960s. Quite a come-down for the once proud Northern. However, these duties kept the scrapper's torch at bay for several years. In turn, this helped ensure the locomotive's eventual preservation. In early 1963, the Intermountain chapter of the National Railway Historical Society, a railroad enthusiast and history group based in Denver, approached the Burlington regarding locomotive number 5629. The chapter's goal was to see the locomotive preserved. Negotiations proceeded, and later that year, a deal had been struck with the railroad. The locomotive was given a cosmetic overhaul by the Burlington at its West Burlington shops and then moved to Denver via freight train. It was briefly stored at Burlington affiliate Colorado and Southern's 7th Street Roundhouse facility in Denver. A date was set for August 30th, 1963, when number 5629 would be moved to the Colorado Railroad Museum in Golden. Moving the 300-plus ton steam locomotive to the museum was no simple undertaking. In fact, it was the museum's most complicated and costly moving job to date. Burlington engineering crews planned the process ahead of time, constructing a grade for temporary tracks that would branch off the Colorado and Southern line passing by the museum site on its way to the Coors Brewery. This grade, parts of which can still be seen today, had to cross the Arapahoe Canal, which was 14 feet wide and nearly that high in some places. Thus, a crane loaded 2 trucks with necessary materials to erect a temporary 50-foot bridge over the canal. Railroad cars were loaded up with ties, rails, and hardware to construct some 1,200 feet of temporary track. On the day of the move, the Burlington's plans were put into action. The new grade and temporary bridge were in place. Crews were hard at work laying ties and rails. Traffic was detoured on 44th Avenue as tracks were laid right across the road. Dirt was then dumped in place so traffic could continue moving slowly. Utility wires were raised to create the necessary 18-foot clearance for the locomotive to safely pass underneath. Locomotive number 5629, which was non-operational, was placed in front of a diesel locomotive with several empty freight cars added in as idlers to be pushed from downtown Denver to the museum. This interesting train departed downtown at 11:30 a.m. on August 30th, racing the clock to make a scheduled 5 o'clock dedication ceremony that same evening in Golden. Arriving at the temporary shoe fly track near the museum, the diesel locomotive struggled to push its heavy train up the steep temporary track. Slippery rails caused a first attempt to fail, but on the second try, it prevailed. Locomotive 5629 crossed the temporary bridge under the watchful eyes of seasoned railroad veterans, Then traffic was stopped as the locomotive rolled across 44th Avenue and moved into position on the museum grounds. With the proud 484 steam locomotive spotted at its new display location, the train that had pushed it into place retreated. Right behind, crews began disassembling the tracks across 44th Avenue and continuing on down to where temporary tracks joined up with the permanent ones. The temporary bridge sections were picked up, placed on truck trailers, and driven away. Soon, the quickly built but effective shoe-fly railroad was no more. Even as the disassembly continued, crowds assembled next to the shiny steam locomotive to hear Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad Vice President J.J. Alms as he ceremonially presented number 5629 to the Intermountain Chapter NRHS at the Colorado Railroad Museum. The crowd cheered as Mr. Alms' daughter ceremonially christened the big 484 locomotive with a bottle of champagne. Denver and Rio Grande Western number 346 was steamed up for the occasion and tooted its whistle in celebration. Photographs were taken afterwards with members of the NRHS chapter alongside museum founder Bob Richardson and co-founder Cornelius Hauk. In the years since its move to Golden, steam locomotive number 5629 has been a favorite of museum guests, especially younger audiences for which this behemoth holds special interest. Really, they ask? There were steam locomotives at one time that could pull trains at 80, 90, perhaps 100 miles an hour? Really? With all of that machinery of side rods and cylinders and all? Really? How much does it weigh? Where did it run? On account of its impressive appearance, this locomotive naturally causes guests to want to know more. In 2005, the Intermountain Chapter of the National Railway Historical Society officially transferred ownership of number 5629 to the Colorado Railroad Museum. Displayed close by the museum's 44th Avenue fence line, this eye-catching standard gauge steam locomotive is especially obvious to guests as they tour the boarding platform area at the museum or wait to board a weekend train ride near the Richardson Library facility. This impressive example from the high point of American steam locomotion remains a Colorado railroading icon, one that has served a long and interesting life both inside and outside the Centennial State. Even today, number 5629 continues to hold the distinction of being the largest and heaviest artifact in the collection of the Colorado Railroad Museum and one of the largest preserved steam locomotives in the Centennial State. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you've enjoyed our tour of Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy steam locomotive number 5629. I also hope that your appreciation for Colorado's rich railroad heritage continues to grow with each and every tour of the museum's collection.
Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Commenting and sharing in particular may qualify as virtual engagements for important funding programs like the SCFD.